People of Reddit who lost a loved one because of a funny ironic death. How did you deal with this? Did you feel supported? My father died choking on a pretzel many years ago. Before the infamous bush pretzel incident. If anyone's old enough to remember that. I loved pretzels at the time. Ate them every day. Couldn't touch them for about a year after his death. And then suddenly pretzels were okay again. Some of my friends and family were appalled. But what was I supposed to do? Be petrified of pretzels for the rest of my life? People die in all sorts of absurd ways. But any death seems a bit absurd to me. How can a person suddenly not be? It's ridiculous. Impossible. Yet it's something we all have to deal with at some point. The death of family, friends, loves, and ultimately ourselves. I'd like to say I chose to laugh about it. But, really, I didn't have much choice in my reaction. Death is the universe's ultimate joke. I must laugh. My grandfather had lost his legs and used a scooter to get around. He was always a prankster and loved to have fun and joke around. His final act was trying to scare someone at a party. He was trying to sneak up on my uncle. He was going around a small hill and hit his scooter. Broke multiple bones and died from complications. He thought it was hilarious. My grandma dropped dead at the dinner table one night and my mom faked CPR to the 911 operator. Grandma lived with my parents for 5 years before she died and they discovered that grandma didn't shower or brush her teeth or wash her hands after using the bathroom. She'd always get shit everywhere and it was always under her nails. Needless to say, when she died my parents called 911. The 911 operator instructed my mom to give grandma mouth to mouth. My mom, the most honest person I know, couldn't do it. Instead my mom faked it and lied to the operator, saying she did it. Needless to say, grandma didn't wake up. Don't freak out. Grandma had congestive heart failure and she was a DNR, but in the moment, nobody thought of that. We still make jokes saying mom killed grandma. Yeah. My family is fucked up like that. Not a loved one but perhaps relevant. My uncle helped build large generators for remote villages around the world. He was sent to China where the power plant was in mid-construction. He was given a tour and came across a fairly dangerous hole in the floor that went down several stories. When his co-workers started laughing hysterically. When he asked what was so funny, the translator told him that someone had fallen through the hole and died yesterday morning. When he responded why they thought that was so funny, they responded it was the safety inspector. I had a co-worker whose mother died in a freak accident. She'd been rushing to go to work. Got in the car. Started it and realized that she left her purse on the ground behind her car. She got out of the car. Bent over to pick up her purse and her car suddenly rolled backwards and ran over her, killing her instantly. A week later my co-worker was trying to distract himself by watching TV and saw 6 Feet Under was on. That was his mom's favorite show, so he stopped and decided to watch it. If you've seen that show you know there's a death at the beginning of the episode. The death that episode? A guy getting run over by his own car. He said it was so shocking and ironic that he couldn't help but laugh about it. A friend of mine was an athlete. With an amazing body. Six-pack and all of that jazz. Didn't smoke. Drank occasionally. Dropped dead in the middle of the night. In his dorm room. Due to a natural heart attack. Doctors said his case was very rare. And is seen only in athletes. In layman's term. His heart attack was because of his fitness. My grandfather's heart was 96% clogged for the last 10 years of his life. He had diabetes and 2 forms of cancer. When they found the cancer, he asked the doctor what he should do. The doctor said, well, if you don't treat it, it'll kill you in 3 years. Then he shrugged and said, but, I mean, I wouldn't worry about planning that far ahead. Double quote. One day, he called up the whole family and said, this is it. I can feel it. This is the moment I am going to die. Double quote. So everybody came out to be with him. We have family in the Arctic, in Thailand and in China. and they all came to Ontario to be with him. We sat and talked to him and tried to say comforting thing. Personally, I said, "How are you doing, Gramps?" He said, "I'm dying." "How the hell do you think I'm doing?" Double quote. We all stood by his side that night waiting for him. And then the next night, by day 3, my uncle started to get impatient. He started saying, "You know, I've really got to go to work on Monday." Double quote. The people who held out the longest stayed for a week. All just sort of waiting for him to die. But he never did. Eventually, though, everyone had to go back to their own lives. And plus we were getting bored. So we all moved on. 3 months later he called again and said he was dying again. But we weren't going to fall for that trick twice. It turned out he was telling the truth that time. This will be buried. But one of my friends died rock climbing. Her rope just gave out and she fell. A few years later, her only sibling, and another friend, died snorkeling in India when she was attacked by an alligator. Both times I found out about it just scrolling the news. Which sucked. Here's a tip. If your friends die in an unusual enough way that someone writes a news story about them, don't read the comments. People assumed they were daredevils but they were both quiet, sweet girls involved with their church and devoted to their family. Just 2 terrible freak accidents. My parents told me this story of this guy that would always be at weddings they went to. He wasn't in the family or anything. He just knew everybody and he was such a fucking blast at weddings. The kind of dude you couldn't help but dance with. My dad said after a wedding the dude would just be soaked in his own sweat because he literally did not stop dancing. Hell, he probably danced during the ceremony too by the way they told it. Welp. He had a heart attack on the dance floor at a wedding and died. And I think that he probably wanted it that way. Party on. Bro. Party on. This isn't really ironic. But when I first heard the story I laughed so fucking hard that I almost had to go on my asthma machine. My friend's cousin was apparently scared shitless of this old woman who lived in their neighborhood. Her name was, no joke, Gertie. Gertie was pretty stoutly from the way that my friend's father describes it. And also according to him she had a glass eye and another eye that bulged. Another interesting fact about Gertrude is that she had an affinity for tricycles. She rode one all around the neighborhood. To buy groceries, etc. My friend's dad's uncle was driving in his truck in the winter time and as he was pulling out hit Gertie while she was coming down the hill and sent her flying into a snowbank and killed her. Based on the stares I got as I burst into hysterical laughter, this was not meant to be funny. But I can't recall a time that I have ever laughed at a death like this. My friend was in a car accident and he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The accident was on an overpass and he got launched out of the car and fell off the underpass onto the road. And he stood up with nothing but some scratches. He was very unlucky and a car hit him few seconds after he stood up. I cried a lot for days. But knowing him, he would be laughing at himself. I miss him so much. A close friend of mine, we'll call her Jane, was killed by a drunk driver in the early 90s. Jane's roommate was driving her home from work and they were stopped at a stoplight. And the guy hit them at 80 miles per hour. The impact knocked the car 150 feet. And she lingered for a week before she had a stroke and died. Her roommate was driving her home because Jane couldn't drive. She got a DUI before she moved out there and her license was suspended. She had just turned 21. Thus, I realized quickly life was too short for bullshit. My friend was so terrified of cars that she never got a license. And only rode in cars when it was too far or the weather was too bad to walk. She got hit by a car while crossing the street and died. Edit. Second question. She had an insane number of friends that held parties and memorials and all kinds of get-together after the fact, so there was a huge support system in place. And we all took time to guess at what she would say to us about it. Probably make fun of herself for the irony. This one isn't really ironic, but interesting. A kid I went to school with, genuinely liked by everyone in our class of 50, was up fishing on a lake with his family. A storm began to form on the other end of the lake, so they all decided to bring the boat in to be safe. As they're tying up on the dock, lightning comes down on the other side of the lake. It skips across the water, hits him dead in the chest, and throws him into the lake. Kills him before he hits the water. When it's your time, it's your time. My dad passed away last year from cancer, which certainly was not funny. He was a handyman, the house mechanic, and a real practical joker. However, when they were lowering his body in the grave, it didn't fit. Someone must have forgotten to take measurements because the casket was too big and they had to make adjustments. The director was so embarrassed she ended up refunding the whole procession. I couldn't help but chuckle because even at the end he was still saving us money and getting the last laugh. My grandpa always liked to mess with my grandmother and the rest of my family. While he was on his last leg in the hospice, we got called in to say our final goodbyes. We knew he was about to die within the hour. He took a breath and then stopped and we were all silent. And my grandmother always liked to jump the gun on everything and jump to conclusions, said that's it, he's gone, and as soon as she said that he let out the breath. We all actually laughed a little bit. He took a few more breaths normally after that and then stopped and passed. My neighbor, Gloria, died last year. Her husband, who she had been married to since she was 16, died in January. She was afraid to be in the house alone by herself at night. But my other neighbor would stay over sometimes so she wouldn't feel alone. Very sad. Anyway, in the summer Gloria enjoyed sunbathing. She wouldn't sit in a chair in a secluded spot in her yard and just go topless. Even at 80 years old. One day she fell asleep while topless sunbathing and didn't wake up. Her family got worried when she didn't call at dinner. So she was found that night. Thank God she wasn't sitting out there in the July heat for days. Not exactly dignified. But really not such a bad way to go. Falling asleep in the sun like that. My great-grandfather's brother died blowing himself up with dynamite. My great-great-grandfather died robbing a train. My great-grandfather didn't die, but fell 3 stories and became a paraplegic. I told these things to my current girlfriend about 4 months ago for the heck of it and said I am destined to die in a crazy way. As will my father. She said not to talk like that. The very next day my dad was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I still hope something cool happens to him so he doesn't suffer at the end. I didn't really know them so I didn't have to deal with it, so I'm just gonna say all the funny deaths in my family. My uncle died in Egypt because he was eaten by a crocodile in the Nile while he was there doing voluntary work as a doctor. A cousin of my grandmother was paralyzed and could suddenly walk at the age of 22. The same month he finished revalidation, he went to work on the field and got stuck with his pants in the tractor and was totally powdered. My great-great-grandfather, also doctor, died in prison because they left him to die because he helped a Nazi survive. The cousin of my grandfather died during the World War II because there was an internal conflict between the Flemish and Walloons in Belgium. A Walloon threw a grenade and my grandfather's cousin saved his friends by lying on it. P.S. Not sure about all the relatives. It could have been an uncle of my grandfather. I'm not sure, but the stories are 100% true. My uncle had just had a clean bill of health and had his heart checked the day we visited. A week later, he wasn't feeling well. Instead of calling his new girlfriend, he called his ex, who came over when he said he was feeling sick. They sat around a while and she said he didn't look good and should go lay down. He said, I will if you'll come with me. They ended up having sex in his room. He was having a heart attack and didn't know it and died under her. Everyone said he came and went at the same time. He was always the joking type. And as a kid I swore it was a joke and he was going to sit up in the coffin and yell surprise and that he finally got everyone to visit him. Sadly not. He was the fun uncle too. TL. DR. Heart attack, having sex. Came and went at the same time. It wasn't not the death that was ironic funny. More the post-death or whatever you call it. My auntie died after a long fight with cancer, but the crematorium chapel place was booked up for quite a while. Except for one day that no one wanted, Halloween. Drove home after through North London looking at the zombies and ghouls out trick-or-treating and then put a sign on the door saying no trick-or-treaters. Death in the family as we were having the wake out hours. Felt like an ep. of the Adamsos family. My father died on the 1st of April, 1995 when I was 24. He was in the garage working on his car. A beat up old baby blue El Camino. My mother was out of town with a friend, so he was home alone. A neighbor said they saw him in there with the garage door open and he waved to them a few minutes prior. He was drinking beer and smoking cigarettes. Apparently, the fumes of the car which was running. The beer and the cigarettes caused him to disorient him and he stumbled. He reached out his hand to brace himself and inadvertently hit the garage door button on the wall. A big smudge of a handprint was left. He must have tripped on a small rug that was balled up under his feet next to the door leading into the house, which caused him to fall forward and land face down on the pavement. He was knocked out cold. The cigarette was still in his mouth and he had a knot on his head. His nose looked broke. 2. The garage door closed while the car was still running. Something like 97% carbon monoxide in his blood. Given that it happened on the 1st of April and the absolute Keystone Cops way that I picture in my mind the routine that it took for him to stumble and fall. 20 years later, it is still funny. My dad was not a klutz at all. He had been shot, stabbed, a race car driver, a motorcycle street racer, one of the most coordinated, fearless people I ever met. I never thought in a million years he would basically trip and fall and end like that. Almost as ironic as tripping over a Rube Goldberg machine into pond of alligators. R.I.P. RLN. When I was a young teenager, we went to stay at our grandparents for a week over Christmas, along with many other family members. My mom had 5 siblings. On Christmas Day, my grandfather's oldest brother died on the toilet in their bathroom not long before dinner time. As kids, we thought it was sort of a funny way to die, and we weren't really familiar with him as person. But over the next few days, we watched as our pap came out of the bathroom crying every single time he had to go. And then it wasn't really funny anymore. My pap died in 2003. And he spent the last 10-15 years of his life pooping the toilet where his brother died pooping. I'm quite certain this will be buried as I'm a few hours late. My best friend growing up was a huge advocate against suicide. On a few occasions while talking about people that we knew that tried to kill themselves or had killed themselves, he would say suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. A few years later, he ended up committing suicide to avoid going to prison. It was really sad, and still really gets me down. Miss him like crazy, and wish we had hung out just one more time. His family took it very badly. He wasn't a bad person, just made a few mistakes and bigger than others. In the end, narcotic abuse addiction is horrible, and a very big issue. My best friend's mother was obsessed with horses. She owned 2 and rode them all over the neighborhood, Colorado. Not that weird. She talked about them incessantly and painted them. Dozens of really good paintings of them. We always warned her to be careful around those fucking horses when she was alone, but she never listened and insisted they were safe. One day when we were at school, she tried to hang a heavy framed painting of the horses in the barn. Either the painting fell on her and knocked her lights out, or it caused her to fall off the step stool. She was found dead in the barn with a painting on top of her and a severe head injury of some sort. Also, my father's brother's lover was beaten to death with a bouquet of flowers while on Varca in Italy. Might be the only one in history. They caught the guy red-handed. Street flower vendor. Kind of late to this one, but my friend called me crying one day saying Nathan died. I had no idea who Nathan was but was trying to console her still. I asked how Nathan died, and she didn't want to talk about it. A few days later she calls back crying saying that the funeral was a mess and Nathan looked terrible in the casket and his mom had fainted from the sight of him. Again I asked how he died. She told me that him and his friend got super drunk and started shooting their shotgun at stuff. They came across a turtle and shot at its shell point blank with buckshot. When they shot it, most of the pellets bounced back and destroyed his chest. While sad, I can only imagine how much of a badass this turtle was to turn the tables on Nathan so viciously. The not so stifled laughter I had was not the appropriate response from me either. In college I dated a girl from Macedonia whose father had died an absurd death. The case was actually national news. So some Macedonians reading this might remember. Her dad dropped my ex and her sister off at the cinema on a Sunday. Said he'd pick them up later. Never returned. Apparently, while looking for a quiet place to have a smoke, he wandered into a deserted construction site and fell in an open pit that was hidden by debris. An urban pitfall. The two girls waited outside the cinema for hours. His body wasn't discovered until work resumed at the site the next day. The whole thing made the news. She grew up hating cigarettes and people who smoked. Another funny thing, which just hit me, is that I met her in film school. So I wasn't alive when this happened, but my mom named me after her brother who died while in the Navy when he was just in his 20s. When I grew up I asked how he died, expecting some heroic story of my uncle. Apparently he was stationed in the Sea of Japan during a rather peaceful time and decided it would be fun to get drunk while he was cleaning the deck. Story goes he got so drunk he threw up, slipped in his puke and fell off board. When I heard it I couldn't help but giggle because it seemed too ridiculous to be true. TL. DR. Uncle partied too hardy and fell off a Navy ship.